Nobody's taking away my manhood. I'm doing time like you are. I'm in here like you are. I faced life like you are. You know, Frank Costello did this, or Albert Anastasia did that, or Lucky Luciano did this, or Vito Genovese did that. I would know if it was true. They ratted. I mean, they went from, you know, being a mobster to becoming a snitch in a few months. You can't do that. That's when you get killed in the mafia. That's when bosses get killed, when they're greedy, and then the soldiers under them say, well, you got all the money. Why can't I do what I want to do?
It's been 4 years since I interviewed Lou Ferrante, perhaps the most fascinating person I've ever met. See, Lou is a former Gambino crime family mobster who spent almost 9 years in prison. Today he is a best-selling author, whose books have been translated into 20 languages. If you want to hear the full story, check out the first interview. For the past several years, Lou has been working on a special book about the history of Mafia, Borgata, and the first volume of the book was just published. I've read it, I loved it, and we're about to discuss it with Lou. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe. And now we start. As I was preparing for the episode, I looked at our first episode. It's been like 4 years ago. And in there, you told me, hey, Masner, I'm working on this big project. I'm working on this book about a history of Mafia. When I'm done, I'll come back and we'll talk about it. I'm like, yeah, it's great. Let's see. Because yeah, I hear sometimes, but people like typically get busy. And 4 years later, I got email. He said, hey, book is done. Let's talk. I'm like, oh, like he really did what he said he's going to do. How much of it is like the way you were raised versus some mafia code type of thing?
It's a combination. First of all, I always deliver. And when I was on the streets, that's what gave me, I guess, I had a good name on the street because I always delivered. If I told you I was taking a truck and bringing it to you tonight, I showed up with the truck. If I didn't show up, it was because I was in jail. You know, something had to interfere with my plan, something beyond my control. But anything in my control, I did. And I had friends around me who were the same as me, which made us really, really a good, well-oiled machine when it came to what we did, which was heists and hijackings. Everybody delivered. Everybody was reliable, which is really, I think, the core of any type of success in this world. There are people who talk and there are people who do. And you want to surround yourselves with people who don't just talk, but who execute their thoughts into action. And that's, I think, a key takeaway that I took from that life. And I bring it forward in this world as a writer. When I took on this new project, I was commissioned to write one book, but it evolved into 3 books, a trilogy, because I couldn't just turn it out, you know, a shoddy piece of writing and, you know, just get it out there, get the money, and move on to the next project. It means something to me to do something correctly. And I think that that's really how everyone should approach their own lives. Every little thing has value.
What was the premise of the book and why did you decide to write it?
I was in Sicily and I met Lord George Weidenfeld, who was one of the biggest publishers of the 20th century, published some of the great books. He published the memoirs of Pope John Paul II, Charles de Gaulle, Moshe Dayan, Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the greatest historians he had published. And we were in Sicily together. I was there for a speaking engagement for a big German conglomerate, Axel Springer. And while we were there, I was sitting next to George, who had introduced himself as George. He was a quiet spoken man, very extremely intelligent. And we hit it off. We spoke about history throughout the evening. And at some point or another, he said, I'd like to publish your next book. And I was blown away. I did not immediately know who I was sitting with at first. So the next day we met for lunch and we talked about different ideas, and he wanted me to write a history of the mafia. And here I am sitting in Sicily with one of the biggest publishers of the 20th century overlooking the ruins of Agrigento. And I thought it was, an offer I couldn't refuse. And I took on the project. I didn't realize how deep the research would be and how far I'd have to dig, deep I'd have to dig. But I kept going. I thought I would turn it over in a year as I wrote my other book, so it took me a year to write. So I figured, all right, I'll lock myself in my office for a year, turn out the book. A lot of self-discipline that I learned in a prison cell, by the way, to be able to lock myself in an office for a year. And it morphed into a 7-year odyssey. Because
Wow.
I just, the research was, I read thousands of books on the mafia, newspaper articles. And then eventually I talked to, and my volume 3 of the trilogy will be more contemporary times. So I was able to talk with a lot of people who were involved. I remembered a lot of the incidents and events because I was there. So that was a lot easier. But the early parts was stuff before my time, before any of us were born. I was reliant on research for all of that. And I was able to do it.
There are some books on mafia, but they're written by people who have nothing to do with mafia, right? They just rely on some stories. When you were looking through these stories, was it a situation when some of them just didn't pass the smell test?
Yeah, that's exactly what would happen. A lot of times all of these writers are scholars. They studied the mafia or they were journalists in court, and they sort of, bounced from courtroom to courtroom when there were mafia indictments, and then they wrote a book. And they gather all of their information from other sources or from the courtroom. And the guys who write the books now, a lot of these guys who ratted, they usually write with a ghostwriter, or they have someone, a co-writer or a ghostwriter, but they don't write themselves because they ratted. I mean, they went from being a mobster to becoming a snitch in a few months, sometimes a couple of years, and there wasn't enough time to educate themselves. Because I went to prison for so long, because I refused to snitch, I was able to educate myself in that time, so I became a real writer in that time. Nicholas Pileggi, the author of Goodfellas and Casino, he paid me a tremendous compliment when he said, "There's nobody in this life like you who is able to teach themselves how to write. Usually this life doesn't lead to deep insights." But I attribute that to the many years I spent in a prison cell surrounded by piles of books. And I had a good support group, great friends and family who always sent me in books. And, then I would distribute them around the prison. But that's sort of like the reason why I felt like I was different. And when I was in prison, I read a lot of biographies, history, science. I liked all subjects but true crime. I knew that true crime was what landed me there and had destroyed my life. So I really didn't want to entertain myself with books such as that. But the guys around me did read a lot of mob books. And you'd hear a lot of, in the middle of the day or night, bullshit, never happened, could never have happened, who wrote this crap? You'd hear like these outbursts. And I knew that these books weren't written well just from those outbursts. These guys that I'm around know exactly what happened. And they, you could, if you know the life, you could whiff something that's fraudulent in a minute. So when I started to do my research, I was able to, now on this side of the fence, while I was researching for this book, I was able to immediately sense if something was off. If a writer wrote, Frank Costello did this, or Albert Anastasia did that, or Lucky Luciano did this, or Vito Genovese did that, I would know if it was true and could have happened, or if it was false and almost certainly never happened. So I was able to distinguish between those two things with the smell test. And from there, if I didn't want to just tell my reader, this is wrong, because that's not enough. You have to convince people. You have to, give people, make sure they have to have confidence in you as a writer and a thinker. So I would then lay out all of the reasons why this could have never happened. So the reader sort of begins to think as I think. So if you read the book, the big takeaway is readers should read the book / the trilogy and walk away with a mafia mentality. They should understand when they see or hear something that makes sense or doesn't. And that's sort of what I want to do. I bring the reader along on this journey where as I'm going, I'm sort of telling the reader, this is how we think. And this is why this could never have happened. And the reader's then free to make their own decision, his or her own decision. And when they read these things, because, hey, I'm laying it out. I'm laying out all the facts for you. You decide in the end. And I'll drop that in the reader's lap at times and say, this is why I don't believe it. And this is why it could have never happened. But it's up to you. But also, too, I keep it moving. As you know, I believe you read the book. I keep it entertaining. A lot of blood and guts, a lot of intrigue. Yeah, all the good stuff is in there. But now and then I do break away to correct or debunk a myth.
There are a lot of people, a lot of characters show up in the book. Most of them are gone by the end of the book.
Yeah.
The first book is called Borgata. What does the name come from?
Borgata is, we used to call the family like the Borgata or the Brigade. It was sort of like a slang name for a family unit, a mafia crime family. So like if you were with the Gambino family, that was your Brigade, your Borgata. And the original meaning of the word comes from sort of like an Italian ghetto. like a barrio in Spanish or Latin American. It's the same sort of idea where, Italians living in poverty amongst themselves, it would be considered the neighborhood like a Borgata. And it became the name of a family, name of a crime family slang. So that's what we would call it internally. The newspapers would call it a mafia, the mob, the crime family, but we would refer to it as a Borgata or the Brigade.
And you start the book discussing Sicily and Sicilians and the culture. And then you talk about immigration of many Sicilians to the United States and Italian in general. Why is it important for us to understand the Sicilians to kind of better understand mafia? Like, what's the connection there?
It's so important, Asna. When you have the strongest underworld government in the history of civilization, which is the mafia, the strongest underworld government ever. In the United States, the government has the authority to kill. We could prosecute a war. We could kill a dissident, a treasonist, if they sell secrets, etc. The only other people who give themselves the right to kill is the mafia. So it's a powerful organization, and it sort of superseded all of the other ethnic gangs across the country. And why? What was the power that it had for it to be able to do that, for it to be able to captivate our imaginations to today? All the great movies that have been made about the mafia, and some of them are really riveting. The Godfather trilogy was incredible. Scorsese turns out really good movies. Why do they captivate us? So I wanted to figure out what was the basis of this organization, what made them, this Sicilian mafia, so different from every other ethnic gangs that come and go, or just gangs, biker gangs, any type of gangs. And the reason was the Sicilian culture, the Sicilian socioeconomic conditions that sort of like laid the groundwork for the mafia. So I went deep into Sicilian history to understand where it came from, how it formed inside the Sicilian womb. And no one had ever done that before. And I dedicate probably about 30 or 40 pages in the beginning of the book to it. And I believe it will live to become the preeminent interpretation of how the Sicilian mafia emerged from its very earliest beginnings. And it was embedded in, obviously feudal society. No, I shouldn't say obviously, but some people have made the connection to feudal society and never gone any further than that, saying, well, it may stem from feudalism. I went deep into the study of feudalism to find comparisons between feudal lords and his vassals and mafia dons and his soldiers. And I outlined all of those comparisons between oaths that were taken, between certain rites of passage, between things that were said that are identical, where you could literally, juxtapose feudal society with mafia society. And it's incredible, the comparisons I was able to dig up for the first time ever. No one's ever done this. And then I was able to go deep into the secret societies of Europe that formed in the 1800s to bring down the old regimes, the old monarchies. And a lot of the successful aspects of those secret societies was also adopted by the mafia. And I draw those comparisons as well. And I show you how this secret organization formed. And last but not least, when Italy was unified in the 1860s, the Italian government became Sicily's newest sort of ruler or overlord. Sicily was not happy to be part of the Italian experiment, this Italian unification. Most Sicilians did not want to become part of Italy. They believed that the vote to sort of ratify their inclusion in the larger Italian idea was fixed. So a lot of the Sicilians walked away bitter. And then when Sicily started to stomp around and tell Sicily how it was supposed to be, how it was supposed to fall in step with Western Europe, they were unhappy about it. And a lot of the mafia dons, who were originally just like local old Italian men who hung out in the piazza and straightened out beefs and settled disputes between families and people without much fanfare, they were considered criminal by the new government, originally in Turin, eventually in Rome, the new Italian government. They were considered criminals by them. And that's when sort of the mafia started to really, really take root. And in the beginning, they were known as sort of like defenders of the people. And only later on did they become this criminal organization, because everything that they did under normal circumstances was considered criminal by the Italian government, who wanted to stomp them out and eradicate them. So it's really interesting when I lay the groundwork. And then eventually I get into the, the great stories that we all know and the blood and guts and the intrigues, which is, I think I go deeper into the intrigues too than most people have ever done. I like to tell you what people were likely thinking when something happened.
So as you said, you start with Sicily, then the story comes to the United States with immigration, etc. And I'm reading through the book, and I'm reading this historical facts, and suddenly you start introducing characters like Lucky Luciano, Meyer, Lansky. I'm not a mafia nerd, but I recognize all this name. I'm like, holy cow! Like all these people we see in movies, they're real. Those events took place. What's the significance of Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky?
Great question, because they really play the great starring central role in the entire first volume. You start to think that these are just movie people. They're actors. They're these sort of like abstract figures who we really can't get a hold of. And I tried to bring that to the pages inside the book and get it across to the reader that they were humans in every which way. And they weren't like, the Bible makes no excuses for biblical characters. Biblical characters make a lot of mistakes in the Bible. We tend to think when we become faithful that they're just, they don't make any errors. They never err in anything they do in their lives. But if you go and read the Bible yourself, you see that they're humans. They're regular human characters who make all of the attendant foibles that we're all familiar with. And I wanted to make sure that I portrayed all of the best characters in the book for good and for bad, so that you would see how human they are. And Lansky and Luciano, they're sort of the biggest characters. They brought the mafia into what I considered the golden age. Luciano came here on a huge immigrant wave from southern Italy / Sicily. A lot of southern Italy, Calabria, Naples, Bari, they all came in one long wave, but Sicilians as well. A lot of Sicilians just like fled the island in search of, not because they didn't like their homeland. They loved to be Sicilians, but they were in search of a better life. They were in search of work. They were in search of, upward mobility, which was promised to them in the United States. So a lot of them flooded into America, and Luciano's family was one of those exodus families. And Luciano grew up on the streets of New York. And at the same time, the United States was experiencing a huge influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe. Jews of Eastern Europe were faced with pogroms. They were persecuted. And they said, hey, look, you know what? We don't need this. Let's go to America. Supposedly there's opportunities there. So the Jews flooded into America around the same time as the Southern Italians. And now they're clumped with each other in a lot of these ghettos, like let's say the Lower East Side in New York. The Jews and Italians are living on top of each other. Maybe the Jew goes home and, dreams of brisket, and the Italian goes home and dreams of a braciole, but they're basically just an apartment away from each other. So there are differences in culture, but there are a lot of similarities in the condition they found themselves in America. So Luciano and Lansky find each other on the streets of New York and become the best of friends as little kids. And they grow up and they become the biggest titans of organized crime. And it's incredible. And I trace this rise through the eyes of Lansky and Luciano. They really complemented each other. Luciano he was able to become an authentic mobster because he was a full-blooded Italian, full-blooded Sicilian. Lansky could not join the mafia, but he turns out to be the greatest consigliere, the greatest counselor to Lucky Luciano, a man who guides his destiny in so many ways, because he just was able to think outside the box and look in at the mafia from an outsider's point of view and offer tremendous advice. And I believe Lansky's advice throughout Luciano's rise was integral to his sort of overthrow of the mafia family he eventually controlled. And when he did that, Luciano wasn't the kind of guy who says, well, now I'll kill Lansky or I'll keep him to myself because I just want his talents for myself. Luciano shared him. Luciano, let him do what he wanted, basically, and figured, hey, the more he makes, the more I make as his partner. So Lansky became a sort of, a free agent in some sense, but he was always attached to Luciano. Luciano always had, was his main man, but in the sense that he could go to other dons and get investments from them and put together projects that would involve 4 or 5 mafia dons from across the United States, different metropolitan areas across the country. and put together a huge operation that Luciano was never, jealous of. Hey, I'm going to benefit too from that. So they had this like fantastic relationship that just really, really benefited not only the two of them, but the entire mafia on a whole.
Yeah, there is a little story about Luciano in the beginning where he was selling hats for Goodman, or what was the last name of the guy?
Yeah, Goodman, Max Goodman.
Then he got to the jail, and Goodman took him out with the promise that Luciano will never go back to crime. And he did. That was kind of sad. What would you say? What was the character of Luciano for you? Like, what do you think of him as a person?
I think he was a normal, everyday person in many ways, and also a brilliant leader in other ways. Normal everyday where, I point out he was given to errors in judgment like anybody else. Mm-hmm. But overall, he was an absolute brilliant leader. He knew how to sort of work the mafia and keep his own crew of his own, which was a mix of Italians and Jews. He had Bugsy Siegel in his crew. He had this big hitman, Red Levine, another Jew. And at the same time, he had Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis. He had Frank Costello. So it was a hybrid mix of Italians and Jews in his immediate crew. And he was able to use that to really, really take over the mafia in the 1930s and brilliantly, with brilliant strokes of genius. And then once he did, he was savvy enough to be very diplomatic in his dealings with other mobsters. So he never rubbed them wrong. Nobody wanted to kill him. He allowed everybody their own autonomy. He didn't try to become the boss of bosses, and on and on. He was just a really open-minded guy. Even when he was arrested and sentenced to, I think, 30 or 40 years for prostitution. Thomas Dewey, who was the prosecutor in New York, eventually went on to become the governor of New York and ran for Republican nomination for president. Dewey was after Luciano, and he wanted to get him any way, shape, or form he could. And there was an African-American woman who was like a really, really like a champion for women and African-Americans. She was the first African-American graduate from Fordham University in law. She was the first female / African-American prosecutor in the DA's office. And she was able to connect Luciano to this prostitution ring, which he was indeed connected to. But the reason why he was connected to it was because guys under him came to him and said, hey, we're going to sort of organize all these bordellos across the city and the tri-state area, and we could make multi-millions with it. And they need the okay from Luciano. So Luciano was a smart boss. He's not going to tell his soldiers, no, you're not allowed to do that. He's got his own money. Everybody has to go and earn. You can't deprive somebody of their ability to earn. So he tells them, go ahead. So they go ahead, and basically Luciano's completely detached from it, probably gets an envelope now and then. They throw around his name as they're organizing the bordellos. And this brilliant prosecutor was able to spot this. And she, handed it over to Dewey, and Dewey put Luciano away for a long time, which was unfortunate, actually, from a mobster's point of view, from the mafia's point of view, because he was crucial to their success. He was doing so well for them. He was, he had a mind where he believed in diversity of all kinds. He didn't discriminate against anyone. He partnered with the blacks in Harlem. He partnered with the Jews during Prohibition. He partnered with Irish. He partnered with Greek. He partnered with Armenians. You name it, Luciano was good with them. So this was like, sort of a big blow to the mob. But it also shows off Luciano as a guy, when I say he allowed them to do it. He suffered for it, unfortunately, but he wasn't a greedy boss who says, hey, that could come and bite me on the ass and make me look dirty. You can't do it. You can't do that. That's when you get killed in the mafia. That's when bosses get killed, when they're greedy, and then the soldiers under them say, well, you got all the money. Why can't I do what I want to do? You got all the money. You don't need to sell drugs. You got all the money. You don't need to put the bordellos together. What about me, though? And that's a good boss allows people to earn. And that's what he was doing when he got caught up on his own.
How does it work in the modern world, on world where you were part of Gambino's? If you come up with the idea, are you allowed to implement it?
Yes. I always came up with my own ideas. That's, when I was indicted, they considered me or wrote me up in the paperwork as the quote unquote mastermind. I certainly wasn't a mastermind. I don't want to sound immodest and say I was not. I was ignorant in many ways, but I did know how to mastermind a heist. I did know how to mastermind a hijacking. I did know how to make money. And in that world, in that very isolated, narrow world, I probably was, sort of a bit better than the rest. And that's sort of what showed me off as somebody who was able to put big things together. That was what I did. When I would come up with something, let's say I got a new heist, somebody gave me a tip. And they said, look, there's going to be $500,000 in a safe. If you go there Friday before payroll, get there around 2:00. It's all yours. You got 2 armed guards. Here's where they're going to be stationed. You got to take their weapons off them. And then you need a big van if you're going to take the safe. Otherwise, you got to stick the guy up if he's there. The manager's got the combination. He'll open it for you. And then I might tell him, I don't want to take the safe. Just make sure he's there when I'm going. Let me know what days, which Friday he might not be there. I'll skip that Friday. And then I would go ahead with it myself. So I wouldn't clear it with anybody. I never would. I did it myself, and then I would put it on record and kick a piece upstairs. But I always executed the heist by myself with my guys. I would pick who I wanted for this, who was good for it, who was good for this. I had a great crew, and I knew who was strong in what area. If I needed somebody for this or that, I knew who to take. And I knew who my best guys were. And if one was unavailable, I knew who the next best guy was. Now, the only time I would really run it by somebody is if, for example, let's say somebody told me a truck's coming out of Kennedy Airport, JFK International Airport. You got a truck coming out of there on Tuesday at 5:00, and it's going to be carrying a load that's worth, $2 million. Maybe you might only get 10% on the dollar. Let's say you're only going to get $200,000 from your fence, but it's got $2 million in merchandise on it. If it was coming out of JFK International Airport, I had a good idea that most of those trucking companies in there were connected, a lot of them. I shouldn't say most, but a lot of them were. So I might want to run that by someone to make sure that I don't accidentally step on somebody's toes and go stick up a truck that belongs to maybe a guy from the Lucchese family. So that did happen to me once where I did take a truck. It ended up that it was somebody's truck, and the guy was livid. He was a high-ranking guy from another family, and he was more angry that he felt disrespected.
Yeah.
I should have known that was his company. So I had to go, and tell him, hey, listen, I did not know it was your company. I would have put it on record if I did think there was, a chance that you own this place. And then I would have been told not to hit it, and I wouldn't have. But now that it's gone, hey, I'm not going to give you the load back. Can you put in an insurance claim for even more? You could make money from this. You could make, if the load was, let's say, worth $1 million for argument's sake, put in a claim for $1.5 million. Figure out how to play around. You could do okay. I might have did you a favor over here. The fact that I sort of was apologetic, that I didn't know it was his, he was willing to let the load go. That's how you navigate the streets.
Did he care about the fact that you didn't want to give him load back? I
didn't come out and say it like that. I'm on an interview now with you. It's more, I know how to talk when I'm, I wouldn't say you're not getting your load back. Look, if I had to say that to somebody, it wasn't beneath me to say that if I was conflicted with someone or confronted by someone who's nasty or something, and I felt like I needed to defend myself or my right to say something. But for the most part, no, I knew how to talk and basically wanted to make sure that he understood that, hey, I didn't know it was yours. I would never have disrespected you, but, let me keep the load. You can make money on this. So it's a way of going about it and not offending the guy. I wasn't going to double down and, aggravate the guy by being forceful with him. So, I knew how to do it.
What is the line between standing your ground when you in that world and staying alive, like not crossing somebody?
For me, it was like in anything else in life. If you feel strongly about something, stand your ground. If you're smart enough to realize when you're wrong, then you could be smart enough to apologize to someone too. Not go there and say, oh, I'm sorry, but you could let somebody know you apologize without using sort of like, submissive words or something. You could go there and let a guy, like I said to the guy, I didn't know it was you. I didn't know it was you. Had I hit, the trucking place, I didn't know it was yours. Had I known, I wouldn't have did it. That's apologizing without saying sorry or I must apologize to you. But if I was right, I would stand my ground. If he said, F you, you should have known, then F you. I didn't know. That's the end of it. I'm not backing down an inch from nobody, ever. I didn't then, I didn't before then, I didn't after then, I won't now. If I'm right, I'm right. So I think it's a lot of survival is, if you're wrong, know that you're wrong and know how to deal with somebody in a diplomatic way. And if you're right, Hey, look, if you have to stand your ground, you got to stand your ground. I was in jail once with a guy who was a very high-ranking guy. We got into it a little. I would have allowed him to raise his hand to me first because you're not supposed to hit, a big guy. You're not supposed to hit a wise guy, period, especially a high-ranking one. But if he raised his hand to me, I would have knocked the shit out of him. I'm going to stand my ground. Nobody's taking away my manhood. I'm doing time like you are. I'm in here like you are. I faced life like you are, so I'm not backing down from nobody. But all at the same time, I hope to resolve things diplomatically. In most instances, we were able to.
Is there like a code where the person who has more power than the other one can't just walk him because of disagreement? For instance, you came to this guy, you apologize, and he's still not satisfied.
Yeah. Okay. It could happen, but those guys don't last on the street. I got to tell you, when you have somebody who stomps around and uses his power to abuse people, he's going. And I'm going to tell you how easy it is for guys like that to go. Maybe there's a big guy who's abusing everybody, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe I won't go to my skipper. Maybe I won't go to somebody and ask permission to kill you because they're not going to let me. But maybe I'm going to put a mask on one day and hide behind a bush when you're coming out of your house and not tell anybody it was me. And nobody's ever going to know it was me, but you're dead. And they could wonder who did it for the rest of their lives. So usually guys like that eventually bump into somebody like that. And their days are numbered. A lot of good guys. Vicarina Sr. was the boss of the Colombo family for a little while. And very, very close friend of mine. I'm still close 30 years later with Vic's son, Vic Jr. Vic Jr. and Vic Sr. were always for the underdogs. They were sort of guys where, they sort of lean towards the underdog. If the underdog was dead wrong, obviously, they let them know or let them have it. But for the most part, those were guys who weren't just like going to say, well, I'm powerful and I'm always going to go for the power. I'm going to, like the governments, look at our governments around the world. Our governments always cater to who's powerful and they always crap the small people, all governments around the world. It's horrible. But mafia governments don't do that. It's sometimes you get lucky and it's just the opposite.
Do you think it's similar in other gangs? Let's say, we don't want to use the word mafia to non-Italians, but let's say Russians or Armenians or whoever. Is it similar type of rules, or it goes back to the Sicilian?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I was close with Murat Belagula, who was the original Russian boss from Brooklyn. Powerful guy. He had diamond mines in Africa. He was involved with the gas, stealing gasoline and robbing the tax money from the government. Brilliant schemes. Absolutely brilliant man. And I was close with him. He was a great guy. He had guys under him, but it wasn't the same structure, the same regimental structure. He had a small crew of Russians that were with him, tough guys. But he relied on the Italians and he relied on the Italian army, I should say, quote unquote army, the Italian mafia, which has an army, to basically, bolster any claims that he had or any beefs on the street that he had. He was close with Gas Pipe Casso of the Lucchese family. So he relied on gas to straighten out beefs for him if he had one on the street. So the Russians were tough. They were sort of, brilliant schemers in the underworld, brilliant people. I got along with every Russian I ever knew, I have to tell you, and Ukrainian. Back then, there's a very big difference now with the Ukraine war between Russians and Ukrainians. But back then, when I was on the street, the Ukrainians and the Russians in our minds were grouped together. They were Ruskies to us. They were both from Russia. We felt we didn't know any better. And all of them, the Ukrainians and the Russians, were very tough guys, and we got along with them really well. Eventually, I was in prison with another Russian boss who came after Belagula, and his name was Ivankov. And Ivankov was a tough little Russian.
Oh, I know the guy. Oh, shit.
What's that?
I know him. You Ponchik, the guy? Yeah.
Ivankov. Yeah, Ivankov. He was away with me. I was away with him in the 90s.
Wow.
And great guy. We were talking about the same one, I assume, right?
He got killed. He got shot, right?
Oh, I didn't know he got killed. When did he get killed? And when he came home?
It's been like 10, 15. No, it's been long time ago. He got shot.
Well, I was in jail with the one I'm talking about, if it's the same one, in the 90s.
Vyacheslav, something like that, even Ivankov, right?
Ivankov, yeah. I mean, you could look him up. Tough little guy. He was my height, small guy, tough as nails. And I'll tell you how tough he was. Got into a beef over the phone, and he got jumped by the Asians. I would consider the Asians great guys too, because they're very reserved. When we were away with a lot of Chinese gangsters, And the China, a lot of from Hong Kong. Again, we thought Hong Kong was the same as China. I didn't know till I studied history that if you're from Hong Kong, maybe not even like the Chinese. But we were away with Chinese gangsters from mainland China and gangsters from Hong Kong, and we grouped them in our own minds once again together. But they were all tough guys. A lot of them were stand-up guys, faced life and served life. I was with them. There was an instance where Ivankov was on the phone and he got into a beef with the Asians, and I think he took the phone from the Asians and they jumped him. And there was 4 or 5 Asians who beat the crap out of him. And he was all bruised and bloodied. And from what we heard later on, he got down to the hole. And the guard who was down there, the hack, told us later, he says, when he got down there, we brought him in to talk to him and say, what happened to you? And he said, nothing. And they said, did you get into a fight? He said, no. And they said, well, why is your body all black and blue? And he says, this is Black Sea disease. It comes on me once a year, he says. He says, once a year I break out in these hives, he says. That's all it is. And they said, what about the blood? He goes, sometimes they bleed too. The guy was tough as nails, and he wanted to get revenge. And I think little by little, he got a little revenge when he got out of the hole. But he was a tough guy, Ivankov. If it's the same one, then I feel bad because I got along with him really well. And he might have came home and got killed. Maybe he went back and somebody else. A lot of times when you go home, you get killed because you think you could pick up where you left off. But in the interim, a lot of people picked up that power and they don't want to give it back. So a lot of times you do go home and you do get killed, whether Ivankov, the same one we're talking about, or other guys who think they could go home and just pick up where they left off. A lot of times guys are home a week and they're dead. You can't just go home and say, I want everything back. I want all the power back. It's all mine. People filled that vacuum and they don't want to give up their power themselves. It wouldn't surprise me if he did go home, if he got killed, and if he tried to pick up the pieces where he left off, maybe that's what happened.
Yeah, the guy I'm talking about had nickname like Japanese, something like that. Let's get back to something you mentioned, and you talked about it in the book. You said when you cross the line, you're not gonna last. And in the book, you talk about Salvatore Maranzano and John Masseria, right? They both, would you say they both were a little bit excessive in what they were doing, or what's your take? Can you tell us a little bit about these two guys? Yeah,
so Masseria was an early, sort of the first Borgata in New York, was the Lupo Borgata. Lupo the Wolf Saeta was a Sicilian immigrant who sort of formed his own Borgata in the city. And he was related to a guy named Giuseppe Morello, Giuseppe the Clutch Morello. And they called him the Clutch because he had a short arm. He was born with one short arm. And I think maybe he had 3 fingers on that hand, on that side. So they called him the Clutch or the Claw. They had a lot of nicknames for him. I'm not sure if they called him all of those nicknames to his face. Probably not. He was a mad dog killer. But they did. And so Joe the Boss Masseria, when Morello and Lupo the Wolf Saeta went to jail together, Masseria, there was a brief stint by a guy named Terranova who took over the Borgata for them. But Terranova was known as the artichoke king in New York. He was a big importer of artichokes, which the Italian community loves. I had artichokes last night. We love artichokes. So Italians love artichokes. The guy capitalized on it and became the artichoke king. So he was more sort of interested with his artichokes than he was in running a Borgata. So Masseria kind of pushed him aside and took over that Borgata. So he was very, very arrogant in many ways. He thought who he was. Masseria, or I should say the Masseria Borgata, for the most part, most of them were from Corleone, Sicily, which was just a little ways from Palermo, and some were from Palermo. As opposed to Maranzano's Borgata, Maranzano, Castellamare del Golfo, was another Sicilian town that's rich with mafiosos. From the very beginning, they just produced mafiosos like Silicon Valley produces, tech geeks. Castellamare del Golfo produced mobsters. And Maranzano was sort of the head of the Castellamare clan over here in New York. And because they were from 2 different parts of Sicily, they bumped heads a lot. And Luciano, at some point, I believe, and I outline it in my book, wasn't adverse to seeing these guys go to war because he felt like if they bumped each other off, it gives us like an opening to sort of like move up over here and get the old greases out of the way. Luciano was considered more of a younger American-Italian, Italian-American, as opposed to a Sicilian who just got off the boat. He came here as a kid. He learned English, hung out with, as I said, Lansky. He's got a hybrid crew of Italians and Jews, as opposed to these Sicilians who just know Sicilians and that's it. My own grandmother, she died at 104 years old. She came here in 1918.
Wow.
And died in 2002. And she was born 1898, came here in 1918, died in 2002, and never learned English because all her friends were Italian. So the Italians always hung out with each other. My father would speak to her in Baresi. That's what she spoke. She was Barese. My mother's family was Napolitan and Sicilian, and they could hardly speak to each other because of different dialects. But getting back to the Maranzano-Masseria feud, they were old Sicilians, and Luciano saw an opportunity. If these guys bumped each other off, we got a shot here. Well, it turns out that Luciano ended up becoming instrumental in bumping them both off, and he played one against the other, and absolute brilliant masterstroke. Absolutely. This shows off Luciano's genius as a street guy. He ends up partnering with Maranzano and gets rid of Masseria, and then he gets rid of Maranzano second. And before you know it, he swept away all the old dons and all of their old traditional thinking. And what he said was also brilliant. He said, look, we can't be coming to America and considering ourselves clannish from Sicily. What part of Sicily you came from, whether Palermo, Corleone, or Castellamare del Golfo. We don't want to do that. We don't want to think like that in America. America is a melting pot, whether you're Napolitan, Calabrese, or from northern Italy, which wasn't even considered the same as southern Italy. Southern Italians had their own thing. But even if you're from northern Italy and you're in America, you're with us. And then as are the Jews, the blacks, whoever else wants to do business with us. We're not going to discriminate against anybody. We're in America. And when he bumped off those dons, he used that as sort of like, we're revolutionizing the mob. That's what I'm doing here. I'm bringing it to America. I'm going to tweak it, where we still maintain our old values, our old oaths, our old sense of allegiance and honor, etc. But we're going to deal with everybody. We'll keep our thing, quote unquote, our thing, La Cosa Nostra, to ourselves. To have membership, you got to be a full-blooded Italian. To be part of our army, you need to be, you have to be recruited. You have to earn your bones, then you get initiated. But we'll work with anybody. And that's sort of like what Luciano did, how he revolutionized it, and how he got rid of Masseria and Maranzano, to answer your question.
And that is an interesting story. It was Maranzano who had this coronation type of ceremony, right? Was it not him?
Maranzano did. That's correct. Maranzano sort of like had the old pompous mentality. He put himself on a big chair. He had a big banquet. Guys handed him envelopes and paid him tribute. Yeah. And when Luciano took over, when he knew that was odious to American gangsters. So when they started handing him envelopes when he took over, Luciano pushed them away. He said, I don't want your envelopes. Don't pay tribute to me. This is an equal thing. I'm just sort of like, first among equals. Sort of like the French Revolution. We're going to get rid of the monarchs. We're going to overthrow the king and queen. And then we'll just be all like, just first citizen or second citizen, etc. So Luciano had that sort of mentality, and he did away with his pomposity. And that was sort of like, Americans don't like that. That might fly in Europe and, feudal thinking Europe, at that time. But it wasn't flying in America where, we don't have a king and queen. George Washington, who's sitting behind me somewhere on a bust.
Yep.
George Washington, when they wanted to make him King George, he said, we just got rid of one George. We're not going to have another one. We didn't get rid of one King George to have another one. So, he basically said, no, let's do a president. You're in there 4 years. Maybe eventually they made it 8 and put a limit on it. But that's it. You just, you do your term and you get the hell out and you pave the way for the next guy. And Luciano had that sort of thinking. Not that he was going to give up his Borgata, but he wanted to try to make things as sort of equal as possible without anybody lording over anyone else.
But here's the thing that I was kind of curious about. He was open about the fact that he was the one behind killing this big boss, right? He did say that it was self-defense. But in the book, you actually discuss it. Like he said, there was some list of
the hit list.
Yeah.
He made, this is great. I'm glad you brought that up. He made a phony hit list, and I sniffed that right out. So every historian for decades has been repeating that Maranzano had this hit list, and he was going to kill Luciano and all the rest of them, and Luciano had no choice but to move first. That was all propaganda coming out of Luciano's mouth. That was never, if you read the hit list, and if you look at the circumstances surrounding it, it becomes so apparent that it's fake. For one, everybody on the hit list is people that Luciano needed to win over to his cause. So he's going around telling people that he has to win over. Hey, Asna, you're on Maranzano's hit list. Why don't you come with me? And you're going, I am? Son of a bitch, he wants to kill me? I'm with you, Luciano. So he did this time and again with people where he recruited people. He put who we wanted on the hit list. And then the hit list is miraculously missing names that Maranzano should have had on it. You know, Maranzano doesn't have people around Luciano that are tough as nails that will definitely kill Maranzano in retribution if he were to kill Luciano. And they're not on the hit list. Why wouldn't he put them on? Because Luciano didn't need to win them over. So Luciano, who really made the list, didn't add them to it. He didn't need to win them over. And then on top of that, supposedly, Maranzano, who only wants to deal with Sicilians, is supposed to hire this guy, Mad Dog Cole, to execute everybody on the hit list. Mad Dog Cole was a baby killer at the time. So Maranzano, who only deals with Sicilians, is going to go outside his own clique and hire an Irish hitman who's also a baby killer who everybody wants to kill everybody on the list. And how is Mad Dog Cole supposed to do this? His plush offices in Manhattan, he's going to have Mad Dog Cole come in there and machine gun them all, or have Mad Dog Cole driving around New York and Chicago and every other place where people on the hit list were on, killing them all one at a time. And nobody's ever going to go, hey, why don't we kill Mad Dog Cole or Maranzano before we're all dead? It was complete hogwash. And Luciano invented the whole thing. And once I spotted it, I laid it out for the reader. And everyone who's read it says, son of a bitch, I never knew it until you said it for me, until you laid it out for me. I didn't realize it. Because a lot of people read the books they read and they assume that, you know, some scholar who graduated from an Ivy League school knows what he's talking about. But what the hell does he or she know if they never lived a life? I knew right away. I spotted it as a fraud. So that's one good example of where, you know, I sort of debunked a long-held myth.
But one thing I was curious about, like if you debunk that, and why didn't people at that time figure out that this list looks fishy? Is it because they themselves wanted to get rid of Maranzano, probably, right?
Yes. So there's two things. So why do we put up with all the lies we put up with as a society now? We're always lied to. Our leaders constantly lie to us. We vote in local leaders, national leaders, and they go there and they lie to us, and then we vote in new ones who lie to us again. So a lot of it is sometimes we put up with lies because it benefits us, like you said. If I want to get rid of Maranzano too, what's the difference? I'm on Luciano's side with this. So that's half the people, right? Then there are people who do question it, but maybe they don't have any control of the history books. You know, if I whisper to you, I'm some lowly soldier who hangs out in a social club, and I hear about this, and I say, hey, Asna, over a game of gin rummy, hey, Asna, you know, this Luciano list stuff, you know, this is all crap, right? And you wink at me and you say, of course I know that. And then we drink our espresso and I say gin, and you pay me my money for the game, for the hand, and we play another game of gin. Who knows? Who's writing history? That has a lot to do with it. And a lot of times, you know, the people who know, what does it benefit them to say they know? Who are they going to tell? Luciano? Hey, we know you're a liar, so kill me too. You know? So, I mean, are we going to raise our hands and say, you know, I know John Kennedy was killed. I write volume 2 of my trilogy. I know John Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy between the CIA and the Mafia. Killed John Kennedy. We all pretty much know that by now. But what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do? The government tells you we can't give you the files, and that's the end of it. What am I going to do? Am I going to go to the National Archives and kick down the door? I'll get arrested tonight. I'll be in jail for the rest of my life. What am I going to do about it? You know, so a lot of things is who has the power, right? Luciano had the power to write history. Winston Churchill said, history will be kind to me, for I will write it. So a lot of times the people who have the power to write history are the people who have the final word. If I watch a video, Sammy the Bull Gravano lies through his teeth. Every video I've ever watched about him, he's lying through his teeth. Why is he able to lie through his teeth? Did he do a lot of things? Yes. Did he kill a lot of people? Yes. Was he involved? Was he an underboss? Of course. All of that's true. But he has to continue to make these little videos. So he begins to start making falsities because you have to keep up with the demand for more videos. So now he's lying through his teeth about stuff he was never involved in. I watch. I have people call me up. Arena called me up one time, and he says he mentioned my father in a video of his that was a complete lie. I said, which one? And I said, there's so many. I'm confused. Why does he lie? Because he gets away with it, because he has the microphone. The people he's lying about are either dead or in jail for the rest of their lives. Who's going to challenge him? Who's going to challenge him if he says me and Aznauer did this, that, and the other thing? If Aznauer was away for the rest of his life, or if Aznauer was bound to omerta, or if Aznauer has been dead and buried for the last 15 years, like most of his friends have been. So, this is like, who has the microphone? Who has the power? Who has the media? Who has the pen? Who has the ink? Those are the people who make the rules. And unfortunately, that's how it works. And that's how it also worked in the mafia, why a lot of these lies were able to go, get pushed around. Also, too, why do historians repeat it? I dealt with that, too, in my book. A lot of times historians don't have bad intentions when they repeat it. They just read other books and they reference what they read. So, if you can't sniff out a lie, you don't know what you're reading is fake. So you repeat it. If I read, let's say I was to read a book, everybody says Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake. So, if you just read a book or two that say she said, let them eat cake when the peasants were starving, they went to her and said, give us bread. She said, let them eat cake. Well, we all attribute that to her. Well, if you dig deep enough and you go into the archives and stuff, it didn't come out of her mouth. A lot of people say she never said that. This came from this, or this came from another source, or, was put in her mouth and stuff by so-and-so. This was the first book that appeared that said she said it. We're not sure if that was true. So if you dig deep enough, you find out that a lot of times history is just, written by somebody, and we all tend to repeat, the previous source. So I did my best always to dig deep as I could, to always find the most original source I could find, and then go from there. It might have been an article from 1928. Maybe all the books that were written are from 1950s, 60s, and 70s, but originally came from an article in 1928. And if that's where I could find where it originally came from, then I have a start, and I could begin investigating it as sort of like R.G. Collingwood was a historian who said, the historian should be an investigative person. He should have an investigative mind. He should question things and wonder where these things came from. And that's what I did. I took Collingwood's advice, and I would always trace it back and then see where it might have come from, and then help the reader to understand this doesn't pass the sniff test, and this is why.
There is another character. There are quite a few characters in the book, Vito Genovese. And he has an interesting story. He was in Italy, right, during Mussolini's time, and he was very close to him. How was he able to come back as if nothing happened?
Vito Genovese was one of the smartest mobsters in this first volume of Borgata, the Borgata trilogy. One of the smartest mobsters of all time. Absolutely brilliant. He knew how to scheme and intrigue like nobody else. Only in the overworld, I can only compare to him to like a Stalin. Stalin was the master intriguer. If you look at Stalin's rise to power and how he sort of got rid of, one after another, he got rid of the Bolsheviks that he came to power with. One after another, if they disagreed with him, they disappeared. And then he would whitewash them. He would airbrush them out of the party pictures, one after another. And at some point or another, after Lenin died and Stalin took power, Lenin's wife was aggravating Stalin. And he said to her, you should be careful, because someone else will have to be Lenin's wife. In other words, we'll get rid of you and we'll just pop another woman in to be Lenin's wife. Watch what you say. So, Stalin was that type of personality that in my volume 1, only Vito Genovese I could compare him to. Genovese was the Stalin of the mafia. Very intriguing, knew how to get rid of his enemies, knew how to plot against them. He knew how to plant little things that took time to nurture. He would plant a seed about somebody, for example, like Anastasia. Long before he wanted to kill Anastasia, he would start to plant these little seeds. So then he could say, well, when that came out, I didn't want to kill him. Of course it was true. It's like, he always had he was always thinking far in advance. He was playing chess. Most of us play chess one move in advance. Great chess players play 5, 6, 7 moves in advance. That was Vito Genovese. He played chess like nobody else. And at some point or another, when he had to go to Italy, which was interesting, he was able to adapt like no one else too. He goes back to Italy. He flees a murder rap here in the United States, goes back to Italy. And while he's in Italy, he befriends the fascist party leadership and becomes sort of in with Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Ciano. and he's supposedly providing Ciano with cocaine, and he's running a heroin ring between North Africa, Western Europe, and the United States. He's all headquartered out of Naples. He's doing this, and he next thing you know, he's given a position inside the fascist party, sort of that is like a starred general. And when the Allies, the American and British allies, invade Sicily and liberate Italy and get the Germans off the peninsula, at some point or another, Genovese sees, oh boy, I got to change my he rips off his fascist uniform and he throws on an American military uniform, and he volunteers himself as an interpreter to the U.S. military. And they said, sure. So not only does he become an interpreter for these generals and colonels and stuff in the military, but he's running his whole black market trade, because Italy's like starving after the Allies liberated them. There's no real economy. So it's just a black market economy that Genovese is running himself. He's running this black market economy. He's providing soldiers with all the things they can't get: cigarettes, women, steaks, you name it, whatever soldier, a high-ranking military official might desire, Genovese gets for him. So now the military is quite happy with him, and he's easing things away. He knows how to deal with the people. And at some point or another, he gets, there's a military policeman by the name of Sergeant Orange Dickey. And that guy spots Genovese, and he says, this guy's something wrong with this guy, and he starts banging on all these doors in Europe, all these top military personnel, going, there's something wrong with this guy, and they're going, leave him alone, shut up and leave him alone, move on, go find someone else to harass. They don't want to bother with Genovese because he's making things eagle. He's not only is he making things, let's to be completely clear, he's not only giving them steak and women, but he's making things easier in the way of strategically for the U.S. military. You have a conquered people that you have to control, that you have to supply with goods. Somebody's got to control the black market until a real economy can take its place. And they liked that they were able to deal with him, a guy who's really, really schooled in, the underworld, and is able to sort of navigate that very, very ambiguous world, that like no one else can. So they told the sergeant, go scratch your ass. Go find somebody else, beat it. And this guy eventually wrote a letter to the FBI, and he said in the States, and he said, look, you got any interest in this guy? And they said, yeah, he's wanted on a murder rap. Bring him home. So he brings him home, and Genovese, when he gets scooped up, he tells this guy, Sergeant Dickey, look, first he tells him, I'll kill you. Dickey says, whatever. He says, I'll kill your whole family. He says, whatever, I don't have a big family. And he says, well, how about I'll give you $250,000. And he says, I don't want to be bribed. He says, I'm a patriot. And he says, look, you're young and you're stupid. One day you're going to regret that you turned down $250,000. Believe me, you should take it. One day you're going to look back on this and you're going to wish you had the money. Take it. And he goes, no, I won't take it. And back then, $250,000 was like, I don't know how many millions in currency exchange today. So eventually, Genovese goes to plan B, which is the rat who was sitting in a jail waiting to testify against him back in the States. He had a gallbladder attack, and he asked for, a couple of pills to soothe the pain. And when they gave him a couple of pills to soothe the pain, they gave him enough poison to knock out like 10 horses. And the guy just doubled over, dropped dead. And then Genovese says, he gave Dickey a big kiss and says, bring me home. You're doing me the biggest favor of my life. I'm finally going back to my, my home in the United States. And, he was happy to go home because there was no case against him. And when he got back, it was a formality where he showed up in court. And, they said to Genovese, the prosecutor said, you just missed the electric chair by the hair on your ass, and he just like yawned, Genovese. He says, it's just, get done with this. Let me get the hell out of here. And he went on to take over Luciano's Borgata, because Luciano by then was deported to Italy after he helped the United States during the war. For his help during the war, he was deported to Italy and got out of jail. He got out of jail, which was a reward for his help, but the condition was that he would be deported to Italy, where he was originally born. He was never naturalized, Luciano. He came here as a young boy to America. So he was never naturalized. He never took out his naturalization papers. So he was booted as an illegal alien at the time. And Genovese then sort of had an easy go at it. He just needed to remove Frank Costello, who took over for Luciano. And once he did that, he was in charge of Luciano's Borgata. And he was probably, like I said, the savviest mob boss. Not since the Athenian statesman and con artist Alcibiades has anyone been able to shift allegiances between nations so seamlessly as Genovese. He went to Italy, became a fascist, and forgot about his American upbringing. He went back to America and became a democratic American capitalist and forgot about fascism. In minutes, he could change his uniform and his persona. It's incredible.
So Al Capone is probably one of the most famous mobster, but in the book, he doesn't have that big of a role. You mentioned him, but not a lot. Was he that insignificant for Mafia, or what's the reason behind it?
Great question. So I liked Al Capone. I liked reading about him a lot, and he was extremely famous / infamous at the time, and still is today. Not until John Gotti has anyone captivated the media like Al Capone did. And what I was able to do with him was I brought him in and out of the plot when necessary, when he was unavoidable, because he was such a powerful guy and such a powerful, charismatic persona. And he's a charismatic guy too. The people loved him who were around him. Unless, you crossed him and you had it coming, you were going to get killed. Obviously, you didn't love him much then. But the people who were around him did. But what I had to do, why he comes in and out, volume 1, not because he was insignificant, but because in the introduction to my book, I laid out how I would have to approach this mafia history. And I did it like a Roman historian would. A Roman historian might center his or her history in Rome. But now and then, they might follow Caesar to Gaul, or Crassus to Egypt, or Scipio Africanus to Carthage, etc., etc. You follow where the events take you. So in the beginning, in volume 1 of Borgata, whenever Capone was relevant, I introduced him, and then I had to get rid of him. When Chicago was relevant, for example, in Las Vegas and getting rid of Bugsy Siegel, Chicago also controlled a lot of Los Angeles through its satellite Borgata, run by Jack Dragna, who had a bit of autonomy, but he was also on record with Chicago. If he had a beef, he went to Chicago, for example. He wasn't powerful enough to push back against New York if New Yorkers tried to come into Los Angeles, so he would call up Chicago. So I did bring people in and out of the story as necessary, as need be, but I had to follow the major events. And in doing so, Capone played a smaller part. And I did decide at one point or another, Chicago was an entity of its own. The Borgata in Chicago has been so instrumental in American life, in American history, in so many ways, that it's an entity I would have to deal with alone. I would have to deal with them entirely by itself. And I intend to do that at some point or another, where I focus exclusively on the Chicago outfit as opposed to Borgata. They called themselves the outfit. And Al Capone as its most illustrious head of the Chicago outfit. Now, there were other people, I believe, who had as much or more power than Capone that I've found in my readings. That's something, again, I will deal with one day in the future, when I deal with more so solely, exclusively with Chicago. But Chicago and Capone do pop in and out of volume 1 of Borgata. But at some point or another, I bounce around. I'm in New Orleans. I'm in Las Vegas. I'm in Los Angeles. I come back to New York. And at some point or another, New York, after Luciano's coup and the creation of the 5 families, it becomes sort of like the stronghold. It becomes the Rome. The Rome of the Roman Empire. New York is the Rome of the American Mafia's empire.
I interviewed one Roman historian who wrote a book about Augustus, Caesar, and others, and he told me that when he started writing a book about one of these characters, by the end of the process, he might like these people more or dislike them. Like, as you started writing the book, who was the character whose admiration increased as you continue researching them, and vice versa?
Arnold Rothstein. A lot of books were written saying, how powerful his role was in the early organized crime in America. And I took it with a grain of salt. I said, hey, maybe not. I'm not sure he was a Jew by birth. How powerful could he have been in influencing the American mafia? I know Lansky did. We all know Lansky did. And everything I researched confirmed that Lansky did. But I didn't know enough about Rothstein to know how much of it was true or not. And the more I read, the more I realized that he's been actually understated. His role in influencing the American mafia cannot be overstated. I mean, that's how powerful it was. And this comes out of mobsters' mouths themselves. A lot of people like Lucky Luciano, like Frank Costello, attribute compliment after compliment to him and how he taught them to do this, or how he funded them for this, or guided them for that. His influence was incredible. So Rothstein, just of a little background, he comes from a little bit of a better background than the usual Lanskys and Lucianos who grew up in tenements in the Lower East Side or other ghettos. Rothstein came from more of a social, financially higher class family where he had a better upbringing. They lived in a nice house. The father dealt in the garment center, had a factory of some sort, and he was a reputable guy. He was honored by the elites in society for his work. And Rothstein says, I'm not into any of this. I just want to, I want to go down by the pool hall and gamble and hang out. So Rothstein's like this renegade Jew from an Orthodox family who says, I just want to be American. And he goes down to the pool halls, and eventually he becomes this sort of quote unquote king of gamblers, where he opens up casinos and he gets with the ward leaders. And the ward leaders were all Irish American. At some point or another, Tammany Hall, which was the biggest, longest running political machine in American history, it was originally controlled by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from the beginning. And at some point, an Irish wave of immigrants who came after following the potato famine in Ireland, there were a lot of poor Irish immigrants who fled, like it killed somewhat, like a million or so people in Ireland, and another million fled. And they arrived in New York, and the Irish, familiar with centuries of oppression, said, look, let's take over the hall. We have a large voting bloc, and they did. And the Irish politicians who took over the hall were very easy to deal with. They were very smart, and they knew how to partner with people, whether it be Jews or Italians. So Rothstein partnered with a couple of big Irish ward leaders from Tammany Hall, and he was able to get permits to open up casinos or not be bothered if he opened one because they controlled the police and the police commissioner, etc. And so Rothstein's partnering with the Irish, and he's opening up these casinos. And then these young Italians are coming up on the streets of New York, and he starts mentoring them. And he meets a lot of them through Lansky, who he met at a bar mitzvah. Of all places, him and Lansky, you think you're taking your little Jewish son to a bar mitzvah, and the guy meets Rothstein, and becomes one of the arch criminals of the United States. But he meets Rothstein, and Lansky then introduces Rothstein to all of these young Italian gangsters: Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, etc., and Vito Genovese, and they all attribute Rothstein to guiding them. He used to instill in them like this sense of like, we're one in America. We're all one. Don't discriminate. We're not in Sicily anymore. Open up your minds and not only hang out with all kinds of different people, but hang out with people of higher class and bigger money. He wanted them circulating in bigger circles, and he taught that to them. He goes, if you hang around in the ghetto, in the gutter, where no money circulates, you're not going to be able to scoop up any for yourself. If you hang around in big places where big money circulates, you'll be able to scoop a lot up for yourself. This is where you should be. And he would teach them a lot of times. He'd teach them etiquette. They came to America. They left poor villages, in southern Italy. And Luciano said he taught me how to use, proper way to use a knife and fork. And Luciano obviously didn't mean that he taught me how to take a fork and put a piece of meat in my mouth, but how to use the silverware, what comes first, where it sits on the left or the right of you, etc. He taught them proper etiquette. He taught them how to dress. Luciano said he took me to a clothing store and he taught me to dress conservative. Now, Italians, even in my time, Southern Italians dress very loud. My mother's family, you had to wear sunglasses when they walked in the house, all loud clothes. Big cars, big, bright two-tone Cadillacs. That was my mother's family from Southern Italy. My father's family actually was from Southern Italy too, but the other side, they were very low-key. complete opposite. But my mother's was, Napolitans are very loud and showy. And my mother had Napolitans and Sicilians. And, my grandmother was Sicilian, and my grandfather was Napolitan on my mother's side. So they were very loud people, but he taught them, Rothstein, that's not how you dress in America. Let's take you, he took Luciano, I'm going to take you to a clothing store. He bought him conservative suits. He said that were gray with a blue tie. He had never dressed like that before, with drab conservative colors and he said it was a completely different world, but Rothstein taught him all that. And then he taught him how to finance. He financed all their endeavors too, by the way. When you're young and you're on the street, I hijacked trucks. I didn't have any money when I started. I came from a family that didn't have any money. So, I got on a truck, I stuck a gun in somebody's mouth and I take the truck. It doesn't cost me anything. All I need is a gun. I could borrow it from somebody. That's how I start. But when you don't have money, it's very hard to start a big scheme. It's very hard to start a Ponzi scheme or any type of racket. How are you going to loan shark money if you don't have any? You got to get somebody who trusts you and says, look, I'll loan shark you money on a point. You could loan it out to people for 3 points. You need somebody to help you. Rothstein did that for them. He was sort of like the funder of larcenous schemes. If you came to him and you said, I'm moving whatever it would have been, a ton of heroin, or during Prohibition, a ton of alcohol, and you laid it all out for him, or you said, I want to open up a distillery. The warehouse is going to cost this much, etc. Rothstein listened, and if he couldn't punch holes in your story, he lent you the money. So he was sort of like the guy who backed them all when they were young too, and taught them the value of somebody, putting you on your feet. That's something that, the mob today doesn't have. I didn't have anybody willing to give me hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had to go out there and steal it on my own. And then once I had it, I could put it, and then you get their respect. Then they're willing to invest with you. But it's hard to get somebody to invest in you. It's very easy if you're successful to get somebody to invest with you. In you is a different story. And Rothstein did that with them.
You kind of devote quite a bit of time to Rothstein and the book. Mm-hmm. I don't want to spoil the book to people. I think they definitely should read it. But the first part is published on January 4th?
The American edition comes out on January 4th. And I urge everyone to pre-order or order it now. It's like nothing you've ever read before. It's coming from somebody who lived the life, who understands it, and I hope you enjoy the ride.
What's the second part and third? Like third part you mentioned, it's about the modern time. What about second?
The second is not quite modern time. So the first one goes from 1860s Sicily to 1960 America. And we cover all the early founding fathers of the mafia. Mm-hmm. The second part is sort of like, an empire reaches maturity. Mm-hmm. And once it reaches maturity, it has problems from within and without that are inevitable. And those are the problems that we see in volume 2. And I call it Clash of Titans because the most powerful men in America have now, sort of like declared their place in American history, American Mafia history, and / American history because it's intertwined. And at this point, some are holding on to wealth, some are fighting each other, some want what others have. And it's a clash of titans. You have mobsters killing each other. You have the United States government for the first time getting serious about putting a stop to the mafia and locking them up under the influence of Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, who was under the administration of his brother, President John F. Kennedy. So you have that. And you have now, you're faced with with this major conflict. What does the mob do about not only each other, which they could bump off left and right, which I go through the whole, all of volume 2 is more of that. But what do they do with somebody who has the entire power of the United States government behind him? How do you deal with that now? The mafia is considered a government within a government, as Senator Estes Scafalva said. What do you do now with this larger government who wants to stomp you out? How do you deal with it? And I'm not going to give it up, but that's the crucial part of volume 2, how they deal with Bobby Kennedy. And it's absolutely brilliant. These guys are survivors. They know Darwinian law. They know natural selection. They know how to deal with, their own survival when their own survival is at stake. They know how to deal with someone who's threatening it, like no one else. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned there in life if you strip away the violence and you just basically show how savvy they are.
That's fascinating. I'm going to link to the book here in descriptions, and people will have a chance to read it. And I have to thank you again for coming to the podcast, and thank you for the book. It was fascinating read, and
Thank you so much.
it's thick, but it went by so quickly. It's impressive. I loved it.
Thank you so much, Aslan. Thank you for the great questions once again. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.